Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Dana Karcher, and I'm welcome to our webinar. I'm excited to be here today to talk about tree diversity and the 330-300 rule. I think this is one of arboriculture's most debated and passionate subjects, and I'm hoping to learn more about what our experts here think. And I know you will as well. I am Dana Karcher. I'm coming to you from Texas, USA. And I work for the Davie Resource Group, and I'm the current president of the ISA. So thanks for being here. Before we jump into today's discussion, I thought I'd go over some housekeeping rules. We are recording the webinar, and we will email out a link to all registrants after the end of the webinar. We have a panel where you can ask questions. So please feel free to put your questions in there. We will have an open Q&A at the end, and we'll go till exactly the top of the hour when we're done with this. So if you want to go ahead and try it out now while we're going through this housekeeping, just tell us where you're coming from, and that'd be great. So that's the question box on the right-hand side in your panel. We're going to be doing some interactive polling in the middle of the presentation, and we're going to follow up with a survey, and we really appreciate your feedback on this. You should get a CEU. You'll get an email with a certificate of completion after the webinar, which will help you with your CEUs. With that being said, I'm ready to introduce our wonderful speakers. So Keith Sacre is an outgoing chairman of the UK Arboricultural Association, a trustee of the Trees and Design Action Group, arboricultural and urban forestry director at Barcham Trees, and the director of Treeconomics. He has an MSc in urban forestry, a BSc in arboriculture, and a BSc in social science. Prior to joining Barcham Trees, Keith gained valuable experience working with other major nurseries in the UK, as well as managing trees and other green spaces in the public sector. He was the chairman of the drafting panel preparing British Standard BS 8545 trees from nursery to independence in the landscape, which was published in February of 2014. He has spoken at conferences in the UK, the USA, Australia, Russia, and other parts of mainland Europe. And as a director of Treeconomics, he has been working with iTree, one of my favorite tools, in the UK for the past 18 years. Cecil Konijnendijk has over 25 years of experience studying, teaching, and advising on aspects of urban forestry and nature-based solutions. He is widely considered one of the world's leading urban forestry experts, and his work has been featured in leading media outlets such as CNBC and in international documentary films. A Dutch national, he has lived and worked in Europe, Asia, North America. Since 2016, he's been a professor of urban forestry at the University of British Columbia. Cecil helped found the leading academic journal, Urban Forestry and Urban Greening, and edited seminal textbooks such as the Routledge Handbook of Urban Forestry. He is currently, and thankfully, editor-in-chief of Arboriculture and Urban Forestry, the scientific journal of the International Society of Arboriculture. Cecil is passionate about using trees and nature to develop better cities and always stresses the importance of building meaningful relationships between people and places. So I'll let you take it away next, Keith, and I'm going to change presenters to him, and we'll get started.
My presentation still appears to have disappeared, and all you've got is a picture of me, which is not always the best thing to do. So that's better. So now you can't see me, and hopefully you can see the screen, which I will now put into slideshow mode. I'm hoping to anyway. Right, here we are. So just get the slides in order. And off we go. So diversity in tree populations. Apologies for the technological error. But what you're seeing in front of you is a picture taken in Dresden some 4 or 5 years ago. And that's Stipulates japonicum. And it's a remnant of a tree corridor that went around the entire city of Dresden of one species, Stipulates. But diversity in the urban forest equals resilience, equals a sustainable urban forest. And I think now over recent years and before, this has become a commonly agreed position. But what do we mean by diversity? So we can consider diversity of species, diversity of age, diversity of size, diversity of genetics, and diversity of public good, which is perhaps a new one and maybe one that you haven't considered in the past when considering the diversity within the urban forest. So let's look at diversity of site. And the reason for approaching it this way is today's topic is the 330-300 rule, which Cecil's going to talk about in some detail. But this is not the only indicator that is used to actually talk about the urban forest and the diversity within that urban forest. So what we have here is something published by Richards in 1983, where he's given an indication of the size that should be the mixture. What should be the diversity of size within the urban forest? So here you are. I'm not going to read all of this out, and this slideshow will be available to you. But you can see there's suggested percentages of different size, diameter of trees to be in the urban environment. And you'll all be familiar with the illustration on the right-hand side of the screen. The larger, the older the tree, the more benefits that tree will actually deliver to the community. We look at diversity of species, and again, here it becomes even more, I won't say complex, but the indicators become more frequent. So we have Santamore in 1990, which is one I'm sure you'll all be familiar with. This is the 10-20-30 rule. We have a look at Miller and Miller in 1991, and where they suggest that proven species, and I think we need to come back to the idea of proven species at some time during this debate, should not exceed more than 10% of the population. Mole in 1989 suggested that no species should exceed 5% of a city's tree population. Gray and Denk in 1986 suggested that one species should not amount to more than 10 to 15% of the total population. And then Barker in 1975 suggested that communities should establish maximum population densities for each species as a percentage of the entire street tree population. So there's several things in there where you have a look at it, and the methodology behind them varies. So you can see that Barker is talking entirely about street trees. And I think it's reasonable to understand that few of these, if any, have any scientific basis behind them at all. They are usually the author's approximations, which has some relevance to what Cecil's going to be talking about once I've finished. Species diversity. Here we have in Trees in Towns 2, the last comprehensive review of trees in England, and indicated that 6 species accounted for a significant percentage of the trees and shrubs planted in England. Monteiro, doing work on 12 eye-tree studies in the UK, concluded that 218 species were identified and concluded that there were a large number of diverse species within the population, but those populations were dominated by few species. Roloff from Germany has reported that there are a wide range of tree species used in Central and Northwestern Europe, that 250 woody species are used across the European parks and gardens. Again, you have a differentiation here. Here we're talking about parks and gardens. Poulet suggested that usually only 3 to 5 genera account for 50 to 70% of all street trees planted, with lime, maple, plane, horse chestnut most popular. And some work by Morgenroth in 2016, where he measured the populations of 108 cities in the world, found that on average, 20% of trees in the urban forest were of the same species, 26 were of the same genus, and 32% were of the same family. So I think you can see there seems to be a general consensus that species diversity, we're heavily dominant or heavily reliant on a relatively few species, which makes our urban forest populations potentially vulnerable. Diversity of genetics, not often considered, but a lot of the trees that are being planted in our urban environment are actually clonal selections. This is a field of Pyrus chanticleer taken at our nursery in Cambridgeshire, and you can see they are visually identical, but genetically they're identical as well because they're all clonal selections, which means they've been produced vegetatively and haven't enjoyed sort of genetic change during the propagation or seed producing period. That again could be considered a weakness. I'm not suggesting we don't use Pyrus chanticleer, but it has to be remembered that should something actually adversely affect Pyrus chanticleer, then every tree pictured there is vulnerable to the same disease. So public goods, and this is the one perhaps we need to consider, is these are the public goods identified by UK government: clean and plentiful water, clean air, thriving plants and wildlife, reduction in and protection from environmental hazards, adaptation to and mitigation of climate change, and then beauty, heritage and engagement with the environment. The UK Environmental Landscape Management Scheme, which is being brought in to reduce the to replace the Common Agricultural Policy. These are the public goods that are identified by government as being important. And it is these public goods, and I think you'll agree that trees can deliver pretty much all of those in different degrees. And what you find is that we can now calculate and actually begin to understand the public goods that are delivered by trees. But again, public goods delivered in different areas where different areas will have different environmental and other priorities. It's a indicator and a guide for species selection, and that species selection has to accommodate a diversity of need of public goods. So that's me finished, you'll be pleased to know, and I will now endeavour to change presenter and hand over to Cecil. And I think, Cecil, I think I've handed over to you. I'm verifying you now, so off you go. Cecil, you should be in charge.
Yeah, perfect, wonderful. Thanks so much, Keith, and good to see everybody. Happy New Year, although it's already well into 2022. And let's hope it will be a nice and interesting year also for arboriculture and urban forestry. So before I talk a little bit more about the 330-300 rule, I would like to just pull up a few poll questions to see how much you know about this rule and about some related issues. So I'll show you 3 slides of questions, and then after that I'll ask Dana to pull up the poll. Just one sec. So you should be able to see this now. Question number 1, poll number 1 is, did you know about the 330-300 rule prior to this webinar? So this will be question number 1. Did you know about the 330-300 rule before this webinar?
So
question number 2. Oh, you launched it. Okay, great.
I launched that one.
Perfect, wonderful, even better. Great, just a few seconds for that. And if everybody has been able to reply, then poll question number 2. And we already heard Keith speak about this. Frank Centemore's 10-20-30 guideline for urban forest primarily aims at ensuring good public access to green space, promoting tree diversity, set clear timelines for urban forest management plans, or foster optimal stocking for urban trees. Which of the 4 do you think is the correct answer? This should be a no-brainer for most people. I guess you're launching this, Dana? Well,
the other poll is still in progress, and if I have to close that one. So let's go through them one at a time now. I'll launch them one at a time. So I'm going to close the first one, which is the the 330-300 rule. So 52% said yes and 48% said no. So that's getting out there, Cecil. It's really good. That's really good.
Not bad.
So
Not bad.
I'm going
Great.
to launch the second one, the Frank Santamore question, and
Yeah.
I'll launch that one real quick, and we'll leave that open for a little bit. We'll collect these responses. This is the one we see a lot in the States. A lot of people talk about this. It was good to see Keith's other studies and learn a little bit more about those. I'm going to close this in about 10 seconds. Okay, I'm going to close this one. And interesting, 17% said it was aims to ensure good public access to green space, but 71% said promote tree diversity. And the last two, set the clear timelines and foster optimal stocking, were tied at 6%. So that's kind of interesting as well.
Interesting, yeah. Okay, the final question, and that also relates very much to the 330-300 rule. So the World Health Organization has recommended that every citizen needs to have access to public green space within. And I realize this is in the metric system, but I guess for Americans, you can more or less say it's in yards, a little bit more. So is it 300 meters from every home? Is it 500 meters from every home, 1 kilometer, or an easy walk?
Okay, I'm launching this one. Collecting these responses. Okay, I'll give it about 5 more seconds. And we'll close this one. So 52% said 300 meters, 17% said 500 meters, 3% said 1 kilometer, and 27% said an easy walk. So there you go. Got something to build on there, Cecil.
Not bad. So most people actually were aware. 300 meters is actually the correct answer. So WHO is recommending 300 meters distance from every home. Great. So after that poll and getting a little bit of flavor of the things that I will talk about, I would like to introduce this 330-300 rule. And 52% of you are already familiar with it, which is great. And it has been a pretty interesting journey, I would say, since this rule was launched a little bit less than a year ago. So a little bit of background. Of course, it's very much based on the fact that we know that urban trees and urban green space in general provide us with an essential range of benefits. And actually, this specific rule is focusing very much on the climate adaptation aspect, as well as the public health aspect. So the benefits that trees and green spaces provide to us are increasingly well documented, and not only well documented, we actually have quite some evidence on what we can do in terms of where to put the trees, where to put the parks, etc., to promote some of these benefits. And actually, the rule builds on that by looking at, first of all, viewing green, so seeing trees and other green from your window, living amongst green, so living in green areas, having good canopy cover around you, and finally also using green, so being able to go to parks and other green spaces for recreational purposes, for meeting other people, for play, etc. And we also know that municipalities and other organizations have been calling for clearer guidance based on the latest evidence. And of course, it's not always easy to maneuver in this complex landscape of academic research. So is there a way then to maybe package some of the latest research in an easy to use guideline or rule? So I've always been very careful to do these kind of things to simplify, but the time came last year when I felt actually there is some evidence out there that can really help us now to do exactly that. And thinking of Santamore's 10, 20, 30, I started playing a bit with the numbers and realized actually there's some really good evidence on 3, 30, and 300. And the idea is then actually that everybody should see at least 3 trees from their window at home, but actually also at places of work and learning environments in schools. The canopy cover at the neighborhood level, so not at the city level, this is an important difference, but at the neighborhood level should be at least 30%. And finally, nobody should have more than 300 meters to the nearest park. There's a lot of text here, but just to show a little bit of evidence behind that. So we know that visible green, the green we can see from our window, has a really important role to play in terms of keeping us mentally healthy, promoting creativity, and also, for example, for workers, office workers and so, to promote work satisfaction as well as productivity. And of course, there has been relatively little research on that, but we see more and more that trees do play an important role in that. So of course, it's very difficult to get a very clear indicator for that. But then the idea is really to use the 3 trees basically as the indicator for that. Why not 1 tree? Well, we want some diversity, as we know. We want to have some kind of variety. We also would like to have some well-established trees, trees that have a decent size, that can harbor biodiversity, that can help with shading, etc. And the other 2, the 30 and the 300, are actually a little bit more straightforward, because 30% canopy has been demonstrated over and over again in the literature recently to be a really important threshold for especially mental health and other health benefits. So work by colleagues in Australia, Thomas Astle-Bird and his group, have shown that, for example, sleep patterns, mental health, but also general health, improve as soon as you hit that 30% canopy cover in your neighborhood. And we also know from other research that actually we have to go up to 30 and at least 30, ideally 40% to get cooling effects as well. Work by Professor Carly Zito and colleagues in Montreal, for example, talks about a 40% threshold. And quite some leading cities in the world, the Barcelonas and Vancouvers and Seattles and Canberras, have actually started to set 30% canopy targets. But as I said, we don't want to do this at the city level, because the city could have one huge green space somewhere in the city, but then actually have very low canopy cover throughout other parts of the city. So we have to make sure that this green space goes into every single neighborhood. That's why we talk about 30% neighborhood level. And then the 300 meters, is that it's a no-brainer in a way, because there's some clear evidence when people live about 300 meters away from the nearest green space, they will use that much more frequently. Sometimes cities talk about 500 meters as well, but the World Health Organization has recommended a 300-meter distance in its latest guidelines. So what does that look like? Well, for me here in Barcelona, it looks like this. And I know I'm pretty privileged. I live in a nice part of town, but it's pretty dense as well. I can still see a decent number of trees from our windows. I have a pretty decent canopy cover in our street, although probably the neighborhood canopy cover is well below 30%. And if I walk about 5 minutes, a 300-meter walk, I come to a green boulevard, the Passeig San Juan, where I actually can do all kinds of activities. I can sit, I can even do sports, I can enjoy nature, I can sit and enjoy cool air around me. So pretty close to meeting the 300 rule here. And just some of the evidence behind it to just show this is not just coming out of nowhere. So quite some research now is looking exactly at that visible green. And seeing trees and other nature is really inspirational. It promotes our health and well-being. And it has really been undervalued, I think, in a lot of the research and guidance that we've seen so far. We tend to talk about canopy cover. We tend to talk about access to green space. We forget about seeing green space, the visual aspect of it. So I already mentioned the 30%, and this is just one of the studies by the colleagues in Australia that really use that 30% canopy, for example, for mental health and general health benefits. And this is studies in Australia done for a large population. And then I said the 300 guidance work done by WHO, but actually quite a few organizations, including, for example, Natural England in the UK, have set standards that are pretty similar and talk about a 300-meter distance to a decent sized green space that can be used for multiple activities and has a pretty decent standard as well of maintenance and offers different types of experiences to local residents. And many of you will maybe sit there and say, well, hey, this is pretty tough, right? Can we really achieve that? Well, the one thing is that with the 300 meters rule, that we know that in many European cities, we're not so far away actually from meeting that target. This is some work done by Mathilde van den Bosch and colleagues for WHO that show that actually in cities in selected cities like Malmö, Utrecht, Kaunas, we were up already at close to 80% in some cases of all people living within that 300-meter border. The canopy cover part could often be more tricky, as we also know from studies. For example, in the Netherlands, they did a study recently that shows that neighborhood canopy levels are typically around 16%. So about half of the 30% that we're striving for. So it was a little bit of a funny occurrence when I launched this 330-300 rule, because in no time it actually went viral, and which was picked up by the planning community, by politicians, and it's really spreading across the world. And as you see here, just some of the cities that are implementing it, cities like Harrison Hot Springs and Saanich Council in Canada, the city of St. Petersburg, Florida, but also several municipalities in the UK and elsewhere, as well as international organizations like the United Nations, and Greenpeace Spain has also been implementing it as a rule for driving its urban programs. And I think more than anything else, it really starts putting the debate up on the importance of trees and also the provision of trees for health and climate benefits to everybody, because it's really about getting trees and green spaces accessible to everybody and not just to a happy few. So we're very excited about it, and Keith and I will engage in a discussion about 330-300. If you're interested in knowing more, I'm really happy to say as well that on March 1st, we're going to do a special course on implementing 330-300 with several colleagues, Mathilde van den Bosch, Kenton Rogers of Tree Economics, as well as Andrew Hirons of Mariesco College. And we're going to go to each of these elements. So I'll give a general overview, and then Mathilde will talk about the 300 meters, Kenton will talk about the 30% canopy, and then of course Andy will talk about tree establishment and how to get those trees into everybody's view. So I'm pretty excited about that opportunity as well. So I think with that, we could maybe move, Keith, to some discussion about this.
Yeah, of course, Cecil. So a series of questions, and the questions are not always like favourable. They're hopefully designed to explore and question some of the ideas. So the first one, which you can see in front of, as I've explained, all of the guidelines as far in the public domain focus on the urban forest and its trees. The 330-300 rule moves beyond this and focuses on tree and green space benefits. Can you explain, and you have mentioned it in your talk, could you talk a little more about the significance of this, why you think it's important to move away from just a marker for trees?
Yes, thanks, Keith. I think that's a great question. I think that's one of the key aspects as well. So we know, of course, that green and nature provides us these benefits across different types of nature and trees, right? So we know that we need to have visible green space, visible nature, and trees are a really important proponent of that. Canopy cover is important, as we also know, but we also know, of course, that green spaces, parks, as settings for recreational activities and as social meeting places are also extremely important. So I think as we do in urban forestry and we're doing in green infrastructure planning, we have to really start crossing those boundaries and try to move away from just looking at the trees or just looking at the parks or just looking at the forest, but really start combining those for the benefits they provide together. So that's really one of the key points behind the 330-300 rule.
Thank you, Cecil. Can we go to question 2, please? So I'm going to throw a wobbler in here because this is actually based on what you've actually just said. So rules such as Santamore's 10-20-30 rule are widely accepted. So the question is, how do you envisage the 330-300 rule being used alongside this? And here's the lateral bit. Your presentation showed Barcelona, and you offered pictorial evidence of green space and tree cover in Barcelona. But I know for a fact that I think it's about 30% of Barcelona's urban tree population is actually Celtis. So they also, so while you offered it as a good example, the need for perhaps these such as Santamore's running in parallel is perhaps a necessity. So again, your views on that, please.
Thank you. I think this exactly as you say, Keith, though I think these two go together very well. So the 330-300 talks about the benefits and about bringing green, high quality green into people's living environments, close to where people are. But of course, having said that, you can ask the question, well, what does quality green mean? And how do we provide those benefits with a resilient, well-functioning urban forest? So there, of course, we need to go into, for example, Santamore's rule, but also other discussions about diversity, as you said, in terms of species, in terms of structure, in terms of genetic material, etc. So I think they're really not exclusive at all. And the good thing is maybe they're both easy to remember. So 10, 20, 30 is very easy to remember. That was exactly also the idea with 330, 300. It's something that sticks, as communication people and politicians have been telling me. And because there's a good evidence base behind it, I think something which maybe has been lacking a bit with Centimores, I do think that 330, 300 has a role next to it to play in our cities.
Next question, please. So, and this is one that does interest me because everybody can read it, but as you've just intimated, there is no scientific evidence, as far as I'm aware, behind Centimores guidelines or other similar guidelines. It seems that the 330-300 rule does draw down on the science. So I think it'd be useful if you could elaborate this, Cecil, and actually explain how you think this adds to the debate or enhances the 330-300 rule.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, for sure. So as somebody who has a research background, who has been working in academia for basically all my career, of course, I want to make sure that the recommendations that come with my name as well, there should be a sound evidence base behind them. So when I was literally standing in my kitchen one day having a glass of wine and playing around with the idea that there's this 30% canopy cover coming out quite a lot out of the research right now, then also realizing that the 300 meters guideline is becoming more widespread, the work that Mathilde van den Bosch and others have been doing, then I started thinking, well, we have to do something with visible green as well. And I said that part of the 330-300 is slightly more subjective. Well, we know visible green is good. We know people want to see trees. We know there's an affinity with trees, but of course, we can't really put a number on that yet. So there it really comes to communication in. If you say 530-300, it's not exactly the same as to say 330-300. So it's evidence-based, but of course it also has an element of subjectivity in it, especially for the visible green part, the 3 trees. But then trees for trees is something that everybody can easily remember, and that has a benefit in terms of letting, for example, politicians, planners, people of different backgrounds know what this is all about and start using the rule.
Thank you. Question 4, please. So here's an article, and this article is available to you all as one of the downloads that accompanies this webinar. So you mentioned in your article in Biophilic Cities Journal the question of environmental equity and that idealistic adherence to the rule is possible. Can you elaborate on some of the compromises which may have to be made and how environmental equity disparities can be addressed using the rule?
Yes, thanks so much for this question, because this is really one of the key points as well. So we know, of course, that trees and green spaces are not at all evenly distributed in our cities and towns, and neither are the benefits they provide. So there's a lot of interest these days, of course, in providing fair and equitable access. Think about the 3 equity score that American Forest has been developed. And there's also a wealth of researchers now starting to focus on that. And then you see it also in practice. Cities like New York have really been trying to redirect their efforts towards parts of the city where actually there's an under provision, as you could say, of green spaces and trees and canopy. So this really builds on that idea, because we talk about access to green for everybody. So it's for every neighborhood, it's trees visible for everybody, and good quality parks accessible for everybody as well. So it's really I would say an intrinsic part of the formula is really to have those aspects really well covered. It's all about green justice and environmental justice as well.
Thank you. By the way, I can't believe that you would stand by the window and have a glass of wine, Cecil. That really doesn't sound like you at all. But anyway, moving on. Question 6, please. Question 6.
Oh, you don't want to do the 5?
Oh, it's question 5. Oh, Dana, you're so efficient. Yeah. So, Centimores rule applies to tree populations. The 330-300 rule moves beyond just trees. It's far more spatial and encompasses land use. How do you see these wider policy briefs, which encompass more than one professional discipline, being harmonised? And I'm thinking here about the planning community and many other people who are land managers, landowners. The Centimore rule is applied to trees, and how do you see this being harmonised between those often conflicting or non-complementary disciplines?
Yes, that's another great question. I think that's one of the, I wouldn't say the beauty of the formula or the rule, but it's actually, in a way it is, because it's simple, everybody can understand it. And actually one of the most supportive set of responses I've gotten so far is actually from the planning community, where people say, well, we actually have been looking for clearer guidance, because a lot of the things we hear are pretty complex about what to do. But this is something we can work with. This is something that can help us communicate with tree professionals, with green space professionals. And the funny story is also that it's circulating on the internet now as a planning rule, an urban planning rule that somebody invented maybe years ago, but it's well known. And there's a really interesting experience I had. I got somebody contacted me not so long ago and said, hey, you should check out this link. This is a gamer who is doing one of these city building programs, and he's doing his live stream comments. And he's followed by thousands of people, and I was looking, and he was actually building a city and playing his game, and he said, oh, we should not forget to implement this famous 330-300 rule, so we have to make sure we bring trees into this virtual city building as well, which I thought was really funny, because it actually showed them that it's coming there already, and people from many different walks of life start to know about 330-300, which is more than I expected.
It's your international profile that does it, Cecil. Can we move on to question 6, please? So you developed within this, you developed the idea of linkages between trees, tree cover and open space. Could you perhaps elaborate and say more about these linkages, the connecting corridors, and how important they might be?
Definitely. So I think, as you say, it's really about these three numbers and these three elements playing together. So sometimes people have said, well, why only 3 trees, or why only 30% canopy, and these are of course fair questions, but it's when they go together, right? If you have to provide at least 3 trees, decent sized trees, at least 30% canopy, and actually within 300 meters a good high quality green space, you almost automatically will start bringing in quite a lot of green space into neighborhoods. So it's not the numbers individually, it's how the 3 work together. And that's also of course the idea of linkages, and making sure that you can go from that tree on your doorstep, walking through a leafy street neighborhood to your nearest park, right? So then you start really getting those benefits all the way through, and there's connections. These are not disconnected, and it will be the same for biodiversity benefits. It's the same for cooling benefits, etc. So of course these connections are extremely important for implementing any urban forestry program, I guess, across cities in the world.
Right, thank you. Question 7, and this was one that I threw in because I thought this might be interesting. It's, in my experience, the 10-20-30 rule has only relatively recently become part of common discourse. So as interest in diversity in the urban tree population has grown, then the 10-20-30 rule has become more and more part of day-to-day dialogue in discussion of the urban forest. Do you see a point where you think the introduction of another rule might actually confuse or cloud the situation as it stands at the moment?
Thank you. I think that's a fair question, Keith. Of course, I've been thinking about this very carefully, and it's, as I said, I put my name forward and promote the rule under my name and under that of our organization, etc. So I don't do it lightly. But I do think that what we have, for example, in terms of guidance and guidelines, is often too limiting. So we see things like the distance to the nearest green space. We see things like canopy cover guidelines. We see a little bit coming in about visibility. We see things about tree diversity. But I think there has been maybe a lack of a kind of more comprehensive approach that actually brings these things together in an easy to remember formula, basically. And then, of course, we have to realize, obviously, that things will be different in different places, etc. We'll probably get into that later. But I do think there's a lot to be said based on some of the latest research as well. We know so much more now about some of these thresholds that I think the time was right to come with a formula like this that is different, I think, as well from what we have seen so far.
Excellent, thank you. Question 8, please. And this is one that's prompted by a walk some 8-9 years ago around the streets of Birmingham, looking at trees, looking at the urban forest, looking at and realizing that there were cultural differences and cultural barriers which might be applied. So, for instance, the 330-300 rule culturally may not be acceptable to certain communities. And I'd be really interested to get your views on this, how this, this application of a one rule for everywhere does or doesn't take into account those potential cultural differences in urban space.
Yeah, great question. And of course, it's super important. Of course, it's very difficult to come with one rule for everywhere. And if you read through the articles that I've been writing about this, and more are coming, there's a lot of nuance actually under the 330-300. So it talks about things like, okay, in areas where, or in situations where trees may not always be the best option, you may have to work with other types of vegetation. For example, if you're in a desert city, 30% canopy is not going to be very realistic, for example. And it also relates, of course, to cultural issues. It's very important when you implement the rule, or try to at least implement part of it, that you work with local communities and you realize that there's cultural differences, there's different preferences for types of trees and type of vegetation. And you will also have to work with communities in terms of explaining some of the benefits that trees have, for example, cooling our communities. So in the United States, they've recently adopted a special program where they talk about providing more trees as cooling mechanisms to vulnerable communities in American cities. And often many of these communities also have marginalized populations, people from different cultural backgrounds, etc. So of course we have to work very carefully with anything. It should never be a top-down approach, obviously, but you're absolutely right, Keith, that this is a topic that we have to be very aware of.
So I'm very aware that Dana's sitting there ready to leap in and cut me off.
Yeah.
I'm not going to let you get away without answering question 9.
Okay.
So could I have question 9, Dana? So
okay, there we go.
Can you go to the 10th question, Dana, which I haven't got written down in front of me because I don't think any discussion of urban forestry diversity can avoid this old chestnut. So whenever the question of diversity in urban environments comes up, there is always the contentious issue of native versus exotic species. And the question is, can true diversity be achieved without using so-called exotic or imported species? And Cecil, you've got 3 hours to answer this one.
If only. Yeah, this is, of course, it's a big question, but I'm very pragmatic when it comes to it. So urban areas are, of course, not natural environments. So we often have had to refer to exotic species and be creative in the species we use. So I think where possible, of course, we want to use close to native vegetation systems. We want to maybe start putting in woods and smaller groups of trees that emulate more natural conditions. But I think it's not realistic to think away exotic species. Thinking about some countries where forests and trees have completely disappeared, and we're bringing back those green environments will also require creative solutions. So true diversity being achieved without using exotic species, I think the answer would be probably a careful no. I think we will have to work with exotic species as well.
Thank you, Cecil. And now I can safely hand over to Dana, and I'm sure Dana will actually tune my ear after this for interrupting her time schedule. But Dana, over to you. Questions from the audience.
Well, thank you. I could sit and listen to you two talk all day. So hopefully you'll both be in Sweden at the ISA conference so we can have more conversation. This will be fun with a glass of wine. Okay, so we've got some really great questions. I'm kind of scrolling through there. Hi, Cecil and Keith. Thanks for the presentation. I love the simplicity of presenting the 330-300 rule, which is one of the things I love about it as well. What is the research on our innate biological need to see the horizon, and how can we build this in without conflict? Kind regards, Sharon, and Sharon, that's Sharon Durnan Hollenby.
Oh, wow, that's a very interesting question. To be honest, I don't know so much research about the horizon, right? That was the idea.
The horizon, yeah.
I had a discussion the other day with a Norwegian colleague who talked about, well, we have to think about sightlines, about views as well into our cities, and how do we do that, right? So then, of course, we have to think carefully about designing our urban forest landscapes. So I think that this comes in as we go along. Of course, we shouldn't just put trees everywhere. We should be clever about creating those attractive visual scenery as well. It's not just about putting trees straight up in people's windows. It's about doing that in a careful and creative way. And I think our landscape architect and designer friends, they'll be a big important part of that discussion as well.
I agree. And I think that the more we talk about this, and you alluded to this when I heard you speak about this at another conference, that this is so flexible. It's really flexible. And so we really need to continue to think about it in that way. So here's another one. As important as having access to urban green spaces, it is also important to have access on equal basis to high quality green spaces. Which aspects of green space quality could be included in the 330-300 rule? And that's from Selena.
Yeah, that's a great question, Selena. Thanks for that. So yeah, people have been asking a lot about quality. So how I've defined it in a very brief description is that the green space should be able to offer many different experiences, many different opportunities for activities. So it should not just be a football pitch, right? It should be an area that has opportunities for play, or maybe some nature experience. It should have a diversity of visual experiences. And there's actually some really good standards for high quality green spaces, for example, from the Green Flag in the UK or the Nordic Green Space Award in the Nordic countries. It goes through a set of indicators of how we measure quality, good management, safety, right, access for all. So there's different things I think that have to be brought in. Also has to do with biodiversity and diversity of vegetation structure. So I think under 330-300, of course, has to come a lot of different fine tuning of how we implement those concepts.
Yeah, that's great.
I don't know. So it's like a supplementary to what you've just said. Doesn't this all point in both questions that we've been asked so far from the audience? Doesn't it reinforce the case for the long-term strategic planning of the urban forest, as opposed to what we're experiencing at the moment, which is tree planting by numbers or tree planting by percentages? All of the elements within the first two questions are achievable if the whole urban forest is planned strategically. I welcome your views on that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it, Keith. As you say, right, this is not a matter of 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. We have to do really long-term planning and look at our cities and see, okay, how are we developing towards, for example, 330-300? Where do we have the gaps? How are we going to address those maybe next year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the line? I think that is where the strength lies. And then we need good urban forest master plans, strategies, etc., that drive that forward. And those should be linked very closely with general urban development, general urban planning as well.
That's such a good comment. And you know, my 20 years experience in the States working in urban and community forestry, you know, our governments wanted trees to be managed like streets, but they're not. They're alive. And so yeah, planning is critical. This is a really great question too. For many in densely populated urban areas, open space in the sense of unobscured views with clear skies is as psychologically important as access to greenery. How can these both be accommodated when land prices and building prices keep, and I think the rest of it is keep going up? So that kind of goes hand in hand with the other one, but any opinions on that?
Yeah, I think, of course, it's very important, right? People want views, they want to see something. And this is really tricky in some of the most dense urban developments. I have to say that places like Barcelona seem to work with that. So they have sidelines, they have open sky, and they also work with trees, I think, in clever ways. But again, it's good design. It's trying not to just pave everything over. And in many situations, it could be difficult to get up to 30% canopy exactly in your street. But then you have to work with smaller roofs, smaller green spaces where you raise the canopy cover maybe here and there. So I think, again, there's this strategic planning approach and not just looking at a very individual spot, but seeing that as part of a broader neighborhood and city perspective as well.
Yeah, that's great.
It's a supplementary again, Cecil. I mean, you've seen the Melbourne tree strategies, and would you like to say a little bit how those strategies are actually gone down into the community, and the community have been part of the development of those strategies, so their ownership is far greater from the outset? So again, all three questions are very local in there, and it's going to be local needs and priorities that are going to drive these things with the rule as an overarching. So perhaps you'd like to say a little bit about the importance of community engagement, community involvement, and community buy-in.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Melbourne is a great example, Keith, because they have set some very simple, clear targets or goals, we could say, for their strategy. But under that, of course, then they do very detailed implementing and adjust their targets and their objectives to the different neighborhoods, and work together with the neighborhoods to see, okay, within those big ambitions, where do we prioritize and how do we do it here at the neighborhood level? And I think that's also the idea. If you do 330-300, you will have to start working individually with the neighborhoods and with the communities to say, well, this is our ambition. First of all, do we want this? Is it realistic? And if so, how do we do it in a way that fits with the community here? And some communities will say, we want more, right? We want more, we want 40% canopy. And while others will say, well, you know, it's maybe a bit too much for us. We would rather have more playing field, more open spaces, rather than maybe just having trees everywhere.
Here's another one that's kind of interesting that Keith already mentioned that the age of urban trees symbols the canopy contribution as well. But veteran trees are hardly found in the urban environment. Is there a way to include the need for old age trees to contribute to biodiversity, heritage, etc.? Or do you think the canopy rule will solve this? And I have a follow-up on that in a minute too. But
you want to answer that maybe, Keith? Yeah.
Does the canopy? I'm skeptical of canopy metrics being used in isolation, because there's an awful lot of variables in just assessing canopy cover. And for instance, one of the things I think about quite a lot is, if we're looking at canopy gain in our cities, the political response seems to be, oh, vast amounts of tree planting in a short period of time, without recognising the importance of the older trees that they've already got. Managing and maintaining those older trees so that their growth is actually optimal will actually increase canopy cover at a greater rate than planting new trees. So I think there has to be a view that looks at, right down from veteran trees down the age profile, how do we manage and maintain the tree stock we've already got? How do we encourage optimal growth in that tree stock, and therefore get canopy gain from trees we've already got and established? Obviously, there has to be planting, but in taking account the existing canopy and developing that, you make the room for more strategic replacement planting, as opposed to the numbers game that we're experiencing at the moment. So that would be my view on that, Dana.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the part that I was going to add on to that was kind of interesting. Somebody named Joe said you should add another 3 years maintenance and care for the trees. I thought that was good. Yeah, that's good.
That's cool. I like it. Yeah.
Yeah, I like it too. So the 330, 300 rule now. Here's a question. Can you talk a little bit about how the 330, 300 rule contributes to climate action planning, and let us know of any examples where this has already been well illustrated already?
Yeah, another great question. And the scary thing that seems to happen is that there's very little combination between climate policies, climate action policies, and urban forestry strategies today. So we did some work in Canada, led by Cindy Chang, a doctoral student at UBC, where we looked at the 20 largest Canadian cities, and it turned out only 1 or 2 of those actually had some kind of alignment between their climate action plans and their urban forestry strategies. For me, it's a no-brainer that these two have to go together, obviously. So I hope that because of the focus of 330-300 is on public health and climate, I hope it really starts making those connections and bridges. And I know that the few cities that have started implementing it, they have brought climate very much into that picture. Places like St. Petersburg, Florida, Canadian cities, etc. So I'm hopeful that this will help strengthen that coordination between the two domains.
When we did the Dallas Urban Forest Master Plan for the city of Dallas in Texas, you know, very large city, we had sustainability and climate people on the committee. So
Great.
I think that really helped. And you're right, we don't operate in a vacuum. And although trees are the most important part, but that's just our opinion, right? Somebody else said that.
Is this an opportune moment for me to ask you both to offer a brief sentence? Because you've both in the last 4 or 5 sentences per. you both mentioned urban forest master planning. I'm not convinced that the audience will entirely understand what you're actually referring to and how it works. So perhaps you'd both like to just make a brief contribution to clarify what we're actually speaking about there.
Yeah, Dana, do you want to start, or do you want me to start?
You know, I'll just start and just say, and then please contribute. You know, urban forest master planning is, to me, taking a holistic view of a community's urban forest and looking at what they have and within not just what the trees are, but not how they manage them, what the trees are, how they're managing them, what tools they have to manage them, who's working in the urban forest, all those kinds of things. So what they have, what they want. You know, people have canopy goals. Is it feasible? And that kind of thing. How are they going to get there? What are the steps to getting there? And then, you know, revisiting that. That plan should encompass all that kind of strategic planning. I wrote down, though, that you're skeptical of canopy metrics used in isolation. It should be, a plan should be fed by data for sure. So whether it's canopy inventory or something like that, we use a lot of iTree. That to me is urban forest master planning. Cecil?
No, I think that's a great explanation, Dana. And I think one of the things that I've seen, which I think is exciting, that some of the latest plans are actually very long term, right? If you think about the Birmingham Urban Forest Master Plan, it was the topic of another webinar. We're talking about 30, 40, 50 years time horizons, which I think is really important when we talk about trees and communities and how they develop together. So I do think that we see more evidence-based. We see also breaking it down in very specific targets over time. But these master plans provide a framework often for a whole suite of plans underneath that as well. For example, a tree diversity strategy or management strategies at local level. So it's really a framework, I think, for action. And I'm really hopeful that there's much more happening in this domain right now.
Yeah, I agree. There's a question here, or just a comment. I think the policies in urban forests and parks need to be included as functional ecosystems, and also would be great to see more participation and engagement from the public to preserve them and improve them with this focus. This is from Paulina. That's a great comment. And I think also part of urban forest master planning is public engagement. It's got to be there somehow, some way. There was another one. I'm trying to find, I flagged a bunch of them. There's a ton of questions, you guys. We're not going to get to all of them. How could it be possible for developing countries which are overpopulated? That's kind of an interesting question.
Yeah, that's a difficult one. And I've been communicating with quite a few colleagues from India, from Southeast Asia, from Africa, Latin America, because there's quite some eagerness, and some colleagues in Latin America have started to think about implementing it, but starting conditions can be different. There is also more informal green space often in cities in the developing world, so you can actually work with those like home gardens or informal green space, community gardens, etc., and bring them into the equation as well. But of course, we know that the planning is often much less developed, so it will have to be maybe more bottom-up, community-based. And conditions could be very tricky. On the other end, if people don't do much, you see trees and vegetation taking over in some areas as well. So there are some opportunities, I think, as well in using natural processes more in tropical environments. But it is, of course, extremely challenging. I do think it's possible, and maybe 330-300 is ambition down the road, and you start taking steps toward it by saying, well, maybe we can get to 20 and then maybe 500, and then we go from there.
That's great. And we have time for one more question, maybe two. Do you think green roofs and walls might be able to substitute the 3 trees from your window in areas where streets might be very old and therefore rather very narrow?
That's a good point. I think so. Yeah, that's a really good point. I think, trees, of course, have something unique to them in terms of how we appreciate them. But there can definitely be circumstances where it could be difficult to have trees in streets. And then I think definitely working with green roofs, green walls, especially those that are maybe not too crazily expensive, because some of those solutions are not realistic for some cities, especially if you think about developing countries. So we have to be more creative in working maybe with extensive green roofs, with lower cost green walls, and in some cases also maybe having trees on roofs, as we see more and more in cities as well across the world. So, and then again, of course, that puts demands on substrate and building structures, etc. But I do think it's definitely part of that system, part of the solution potentially.
Yeah, when I went to Croatia and to talk about urban forestry, I was like, where do they plant their trees in some of these cities? Definitely different. So it is almost the top of the hour. So you got a lot of compliments. There's a lot of great questions in here. This seems very ideal, but if you tried looking into how it will be applicable to emerging and developing countries, which we kind of talked about already, I just think that there's so many ways that this is applicable. And I'm excited, Cecil, I've already talked about it a number of times, and people are very interested in it. And Keith, thanks for the work on the studies that you put together in your slides. I'm going to have to go back and take a look at some of those and some of that history that we've been dealing with for a long time in urban and community forestry. So once again, we'll get a certificate. This has been recorded. I apologize for not being able to get to everybody's questions, but I really want to thank Cecil and Keith for their participation in this. I thought it was great. I learned a lot, and I hope everybody else did as well. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you for your management of the situation, Dana, and I do apologise for my errant behaviour.
Oh. I'll see you in Sweden. We'll talk about it.
All right then.
Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks a lot, folks. Thanks for listening.